Today we are making one of my favorite patterns ever, the Skyline Dress, which is a beginner-friendly midi dress. It has an option for tiers or no tiers, and my favorite part is the back, which has an adjustable strap. So these straps feed into a channel along the back of the neckline so that you can tie it and retie it and like lengthen these straps, which not only makes the dress like lower and higher, right? But it really does, because it goes through the back channel. It gives it a little bit more ease in the bust. So if you want to layer the dress and wear like a t-shirt underneath, you can kind of loosen the straps up and that will expand the dress a bit so that it doesn't bunch your shirt up, which is amazing. So it's one of my favorite dresses because it's so easy to just throw and go. Like those days when you just don't know what you want to wear, it's like a very easy, like, oh, I'm just gonna throw that dress on, and you can look super put together, and you can dress it up or dress it down and kind of do whatever vibe you want. So the pattern is really straightforward. It's rated confident beginner, so if you are new-ish to sewing, you shouldn't really have many problems, especially if you're walking through this tutorial with me. We're gonna go through everything and you will have a super fun time. Promise. I also wanted to mention this pattern has a ton of hacks that you can do. You can make it into a top, you can put the bow in front or on your shoulder, you can do like a center bow, you can switch the construction of the front and back neckline so the channel is here, you can make your dress longer or shorter, you can add a built-in bra. There's so many things that you can do with it, and at the end of the pattern, like the last couple pages of the pattern, I've like listed out all of the things that you can do, or a bunch of ideas that I've had, and given you some guidance on how you can go about them. Some of them are just like written, straightforward, guided instructions, and some of them I've actually filmed full video tutorials for. So if that's something you're interested in, I'll link the video tutorials I have in this description. But then in the pattern, you can find the guidance for all of the other hacks you want to do. So it's a fun one. I have made so much of this pattern just because there are so many options of things you can do with it. Okay, so we are going to walk through just the basic straightforward construction in this video, but I do have a couple notes I want to point out first. I will be cutting out my fabric and showing you how I cut my fabric, and I've opted to print just the first 10 pages of the pattern. So there are 29 pages total in the like print at home file if you're printing it yourself. And I'll also mention, if you need guidance on how to print the pattern at home, I have a video for that too. So I'll link that in the description. But the first 10 pages of the pattern have the front and back bodice, which are these two pieces. And then they also include the pocket bag, which is piece H. And then they also include the front neckline binding, which is piece C. So those 4 pattern pieces are on the first 10 pages, and then the rest of the 10 pages have the skirt tiers, the top tier and bottom tier of the skirt, and they also have the straps. All of those pieces are just rectangles, and so the pattern has the measurements for those rectangles if you'd rather not print off the pages and you just want to measure them as you cut your fabric. So that is what I'm doing today. I'm going to measure out my skirt tiers and my straps. And I'm also doing a tiered version of the skirt today. You can do a version that's just one long skirt, and the measurements for that are also in the pattern. For the straps and for the neckline, we're basically going to be making our own bias tape. And if you don't want to do that, some people don't like doing that. I like making my own, so we're gonna do that today. But if you don't like doing that, you can purchase pre-made bias tape, which looks like this. This is double fold 1/2 inch bias tape. It comes in tons of colors and you can find it all over the place. I'll link some if you need an example of what to look for in that. And if you are gonna use pre-made bias tape, there are measurements in the pattern for how much you need and instructions around anything that differs, but it's basically the same process. Last note, you may see on the size chart that depending on what width of fabric you're using, because there are like kind of common fabric widths, generally 44 inch, 54 inch, or 60 inch wide fabric. Sometimes it's in between, but those are the most common. If you're using a narrower fabric, like 44 inch wide fabric is typically like quilting cottons. And if you're using a narrow width of fabric like that, you may run into issues with the bottom tier of your skirt with it just not being wide enough to cut the pattern pieces as they currently are. If you run into that issue, you can do a number of things. You could just omit that bottom tier and have no tiers in the skirt, or you can cut that bottom tier into multiple panels. The dress that I'm wearing right now was a 44-inch wide fabric, and it actually, with the selvage, came out a little bit more narrow than 44 inches. And so I couldn't cut the bottom tier as the measurements dictated. So what I did, instead of cutting the front and back piece of the bottom tier, I actually cut 3 panels instead of the normal 2, and just divided that total circumference into 3 panels. You could also do it in 4 panels. So instead of cutting that pattern piece on the fold, you would just cut 4 separate panels. I'm making a size 8 today. So the pattern piece for the bottom tier of the skirt is 42 inches wide, and my fabric is 48 inches wide. So that's not going to be an issue for me today, but I've made a lot of Skyline dresses and other tiered dresses where I had to break up wider tiers into multiple panels, and it works out great. So if you want to do that, by all means, go ahead. Okay, I think that's it. I am going to cut out my pattern pieces, and then we are going to jump into construction. Fabric that I'm using today is a block print cotton from Fluid Plus Drape, and I will link that in the description. It's been pre-washed and pre-ironed. There are a couple wrinkles just from it sitting in my closet for a few weeks, but not enough that I'm worried about it. So I washed my fabric, I have ironed it out, and now we are going to cut into it. So I cut everything on a cutting mat using a rotary cutter and a straight edge. I swear by this method. You can cut your fabric however you want to, but that is how I like to do it. And all of the tools I use are linked in the description as well. Okay, so when I cut my fabric, the first thing I do is I cut the biggest pieces first. So the biggest piece for this pattern is going to be the bottom tier of the skirt. So I'm gonna cut that first. And like I mentioned, I'm not using an actual pattern piece for it. I'm going to be cutting it from the measurements that were listed in the pattern. So I'm cutting a size 8, which means that my bottom tier is going to be 42 inches wide by 24 inches long. And I need to cut 2 of those panels. I also cut my fabric not on the fold. So cutting on the fold would mean where the bolt is folded in half. A lot of pattern designers will have a set layout that you should cut on the fold. That would make sense if there's one set way that makes sense for every size to cut the fabric, but it saves a lot of fabric if you cut in one single layer and then kind of Tetris your pieces around to see how they work best for your size. Because if I had everyone follow the same cutting layout, you would probably end up wasting a ton of fabric because it's not tailored to your specific size. So that is why I cut in a single layer and not on the fold. First, I'm just squaring off this bottom edge here to get it straight. And then I'm going to square off this edge. Okay, so I've marked up here 24 inches, and then I need to do 42 inches going this way. My cutting mat, right now it's cut at 45, so 40 minus 42 would be at 3 inches. Beautiful. Okay, this may be blasphemous, but because I already have one rectangle cut like this and I just need to cut one exactly the same, it's gonna be way easier to just lay this on top of the fabric and cut a rectangle around it. There may be some slightly imprecise lines here and there, but because it's a gathered skirt, it's not gonna really make that much difference. So I am just going to lay this on top of the next swatch of fabric here and cut around it. Okay, great. Now we have 2 of the bottom tiers, so I'm just going to cut 2 pieces of the top tier. Because this tier is much shorter and it's only 13 inches long, I'm going to cut both of them without having to shift my fabric. So since it's 13 inches long, I'm going to cut it 26 inches long and then cut it in half. So it's 13 by 31 and a half. Okay, so that's the 2 panels, and then we just need to slice it in half. Okay, now that we have both skirt tiers, this bit on the edge will probably be too small to do anything with this pattern. I'm sure I can use it for something else down the road. But this section here, I'm sure I can get some good usage out of. Let's see, I have my pocket piece and my neckline binding that I'll need to cut. And then I also need to cut the strap pieces, which are 22 and 25 inches. I have a short strap and a long strap. It's asymmetrical because of the bow. And I'm gonna need to cut 2 of each of those. So I don't think this is gonna be wide enough to do either of the straps. Yeah, so I'm gonna get my pockets and my neckline out of here. The neckline's pretty small, so I'm sure I could fit that in lots of places. The pocket bag, so I need 4 of these mirrored, which means mirror images of each other. So 2 facing this direction and 2 facing this direction. And I think if I stack them, I should be able to get everything out of here. So I'm going to use this straight edge that I've already cut. That is pretty close to the selvage edge here, but it's gonna be fine because there's a bit of seam allowance here, so I'm not too worried about that. All right, there are our pockets. We have 4 mirrored pockets. Okay, I think I'm gonna do this piece last because it's the smallest. So now we have our bodice pieces. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold the edge over. I'm just trying to get the selvage to kind of line up. I can see where it was folded in the middle of the bolt to make sure that it's on the grain as much as we can get. Which that's what this arrow means, is that's showing the grain line. So this arrow should be parallel to the selvage edge here. So I want to cut my bodice piece with this arrow parallel to the selvage. I don't want to cut it so that the arrow is going perpendicular, and that's just so that the grain of the fabric is going in the direction that the garment was designed to be. So I just need one of these on the fold and then one of the back bodice on the fold. And as you can see, the fold does not refer to like the fold in the center of the bolt. It just means to cut it, you know, fold your fabric wherever it makes sense and cut there. So there is my front bodice. And then the back bodice is going to be basically the same width as your front bodice, so you can use the same fold. You probably don't need to find a new place to cut on your fabric. Okay, so all we have left are the straps and the neckline. So those are cut on the bias, and my grid and my straight edge both have lines at a 45-degree angle, which is essentially just what cutting on the bias means. The reason that we cut on the bias is because fabric has a stretch on a diagonal, like on the 45-degree diagonal, there's a bit of stretch to it. And so it will have the straps and the neckline, give them a little bit of a curve to it. So if you're cutting straight on the grain, your straps and your neckline are going to kind of look a little bit wonky. They won't tie as well and they won't curve as well. So the short strap is 22 inches and we're cutting 2 of them. And the long strap is 25 inches and we're also cutting 2 of them. So basically you're gonna take those 2 strips and attach them together once we get to the construction part. So make sure you are cutting 2 of them and not just 1 of them. Otherwise your straps will be comically short. So basically what I'm going to do is line up my 45-degree line here on the grid and find that 45-degree angle. And because my straight edge is 24 inches long, I basically need a line that is slightly shorter than that to get the 22-inch line for my short strap. I think I'm going to use this to cut out my neckline, which I just need 1 of. And there is a little notch on the neckline as well. Okay, so I have that. The short strap is 22 inches long and 1 3/4 inch wide, and I'm cutting 2 of them. So I'm gonna cut the width, what's 1 3/4 times 2? 3.5? Yeah, 3.5. So I'm gonna cut a rectangle that's 3.5 by 22. And then cut that in half to 1 3/4. Okay, so now I have my 2 pieces of the short strap. And then same thing with the long strap, but it's 25 inches. Beautiful. Okay, I feel like we cut that pretty efficiently. I still have a lot of this fabric left. I'm gonna make like shorts or something. This is a cute one. Okay, I'm just gonna count these off to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. So I have my neckline binding. I have 2 long straps, 2 short straps. I have my back bodice, my front bodice, 4 pockets, a short tier of my skirt, and a long tier of my skirt. That should be everything. Okay, let's sew it together. This one comes together super fast too. Let's jump into it. I first wanted to draw your attention to the fabric I'm using and specifically what side is the right and wrong side. So you can see here, this is the wrong side of the fabric where the bunnies are less defined, and this is the right side of the fabric where you can see them more clearly. So I'll try to call that out during construction, but just be mindful of what the right and wrong sides look like for my fabric. First step is we are going to stay stitch along the curved edges of the armholes here. So the reason we're stay stitching is so that when we're constructing our bias binding around those armholes, there isn't any stretching or gaping happening to the fabric. So go in with a stay stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance with about a 2mm stitch length. You also want to make sure that you're doing all your stay stitches going the same direction. So starting around the neckline and then going down toward the armpit for both sides and both bodices. So you can see here on the front bodice, we also have that stay stitch in place. Next, we'll be doing 2 rows of basting stitches along the front neckline. So a basting stitch is just the longest stitch length on your machine. For me, that's 5mm. So I'm first going to go in at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along this neckline. And then I'm going to go back through again and do a second basting stitch at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Don't do any back stitching at the beginning or end of your stitch, and make sure that you're leaving long tails because that is what we are going to pull the basting stitch with. And the reason we do a basting stitch is that that long stitch length allows us to gather our fabric. We now need to fold our neckline binding into bias tape. If you're using pre-made bias tape, you can skip over this step. But you can see here I have my neckline binding. It's right side facing down at the moment, and I'm going to use one of these fancy pantsy bias tape makers because they make the folding very nice and easy. So typically when you fold bias tape, you just fold those raw edges in toward the center, and what this bias tape maker does is as you pull the bias tape maker along the fabric, it folds those raw edges in toward the center equidistantly so that everything is really nice and even, and it just makes the whole process go faster. I've linked them in the description. You don't have to use this tool. You can just fold those edges in on your own, but if you want something to help, I would highly recommend this. Once those raw edges are folded in toward the center, all you need to do is fold your bias tape strip in half and give it another press. I realized at this stage that I forgot to cut my notches in my bodice piece, so if you forgot to do that as well when you cut your fabric, cut a notch in the center front both on the bottom and top of your bodice, but make sure not to snip into your basting stitches. The center of your neckline binding should also have a notch. I did remember to cut that one. So we are going to pin that with the center front notch of your bodice with the right side of the binding to the wrong side of your bodice. I've matched up and pinned the center point there and then both ends of the neckline, and now we just need to gather the front of that bodice. So find your tails of the basting stitches that you left. You'll have 4 threads coming out there, 2 from each basting stitch, and you're going to want to grab 2 threads on the same side of the fabric and then pull along the fabric to make your gathers. All you need to do is pull and adjust those gathers until they're evenly laying against your neckline binding and then pin them in place. As you can see here, I typically gather toward the center and then pin 1/2 of it, and then I go to the other side of the binding and pull those threads the other direction toward the center again. So instead of gathering all the way along your basting stitch, I do it halfway and then repeat the process on the other half. So we are going to stitch these gathers in place with the neckline binding being face up. So technically that binding is like visually covering up your gathers, right? But we are going to go in with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is going to fall right in between your two basting stitches because those are at 1/4 inch and 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. So we'll be stitching right along this fold in the bias tape, which is going to be 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I know that this can be a bit of a trust the process moment because you can't see your gathers, but as long as your seam allowances for your basting stitch and for this stitch are as they should be, everything is going to line up perfectly. Here you can see that stitch done. It's right in the ditch of that bias tape fold. And then on the other side, you can clearly see the 3 rows of stitching, 2 of which are basting stitch, 1 is just a regular straight stitch. And also you can see one of the basting stitch is going to be visible, and so all you have to do is just unpick a couple of the threads at the beginning and pull it out of the way. Depending on what fabric you're using, pulling out that basting stitch may make these little holes. My fabric actually was very holey after removing those. Don't stress about it. Literally all you have to do is just rub your finger along the holes sort of aggressively and it'll make them disappear. And even if they're still left over a teeny bit, throughout the construction of the rest of the dress, they'll kind of fade over time. Now we are going to fold our neckline binding over along the bias tape folds that we already made and create the binding here for the neckline. I found for bindings like this, I really love using clips instead of pins, and you'll see kind of throughout the process, I switch back and forth between clips and pins depending on what elements I'm pinning at the time. And I've linked these pins in the description because they're my favorite. Then we just need to top stitch along the edge of that binding there to secure it in place. And because this edge stitch is going to be, you know, front and center on the dress, I really take my time here. I kind of feel as I go. You can see I'm feeling under the bias tape to make sure I folded it over enough that it's covering up the stitching that should be hidden within the binding. Here's what the front of my binding looks like. I feel like it turned out really nice and pretty. The back is slightly wonky, but no one's gonna see it. So I feel like it's good enough and it looks really nice. Now I'm going to attach my front and back bodice. So I have my front bodice here laying face up, and then I'm going to take my back bodice and lay it face down so that the right sides are together. And then I'm going to pin along the side seams. Then we are going to stitch along the side seams at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you're going to want to finish those raw edges somehow. I'm going to finish mine with my serger. If you don't have a serger, that's totally fine. I actually have a video explaining some methods to finish your raw edges if you don't have a serger, so you can check that out or just finish them however your preferred method is. Flipping my bodice right way around, you can see the side seam here, that seam allowance is just poking out a little bit, so I'm just going to trim it out of the way so that the curve of the armhole is nice and even. And then I'll be pressing those seams flat. Alright, it's time to make some straps. We have a long strap and a short strap, and I'm going to be showing you on the short strap, but the process is the same for the long one, so just repeat all these steps again on that strap. So we have 2 pieces here of the short strap, and what we're going to do is lay one on top of the other, right sides together in a perpendicular fashion. And we're going to sew a diagonal line to join the pieces. So what I usually do is pin in a diagonal direction as well to kind of, it's not like a precise diagonal line, the pins, but it just kind of helps me visualize the direction of my line. You can also use some like tailor's chalk or something to mark an exact line. I usually just eyeball it because it doesn't make a huge difference. So that's kind of just my style though. So sew those 2 strips together and trim away the seam allowance. And I did also want to mention the reason that I had you cut 2 pieces of each strap instead of just cutting 1 long strap is just because it saves fabric. If you're cutting a giant long like 50-inch piece of fabric across the bias of your fabric, that's going to waste so much. So that's why it's in 2 different pieces. Now that that's sewn together, I'm just going to press that seam allowance open flat, and I'm going to do the same process and use my fancy bias tape maker to fold this long strap into bias tape. Obviously, if you're using pre-made bias tape, you will skip all of these steps to make your own. I personally like making my own though. I feel like it makes your garment look a lot more cohesive, and also the feel of the fabric will be cohesive. Like pre-made bias tape, I feel like is often very stiff and starchy. A lot of times it's used for quilting. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. All right, once you have made both of your straps, it's time to attach them to the bodice. So we are going to be pinning it to the wrong side of your bodice, which has been all sewn together here. So we're going to be pinning it along this curved armhole edge. And a couple notes here, it doesn't matter which strap you put on which side, it's just up to you. Just keep in mind, whatever side you put the short strap on, that's going to be where the bow is on the back. And then also be aware that the way that you're pinning and sewing these straps in place is going to be mirrored on each side. So don't let that kind of throw you off. On both sides, the strap should be flush with the back neckline and then curve all the way along the armhole and continue on past the front neckline. And that's where the long tail of the strap should shoot off from, is the front neckline, because then you're going to circle it back around and tie it through the back neckline. Once you've pinned those straps in place, again, the right side of the strap to the wrong side of the bodice, then you're going to sew them in place. So similarly to how the neckline binding was, we're going to be kind of stitching in the ditch of that bias tape fold, which is a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So on one side, I started at the back neckline and continued through to the front neckline, back stitching a little bit there so that those stitches aren't going to come out. And then on the other side, I would start at where the strap connects to the front neckline and continue through to the back neckline. Now, in the same way that we folded the bias tape neckline over to encase that raw edge, we're going to do the same thing here with the straps, encasing the raw edge of the armhole. So we're folding that bias tape over along the folds that we had pre-folded, pressed, and we are going to clip those in place. And again, I find the binding clips to be extra helpful for these types of steps. Now, the tail end of your straps right now is just a raw edge, and honestly, you could leave it that way if you want to. It would probably fray a little bit, but not too much. But if you want to finish the end of it to have it look really nice and enclosed, you would just need to kind of unfold the end of the bias tape there backward on itself. And I think this is one of those things that is way easier to see visually than it is to explain verbally. So hopefully you're kind of seeing how I've folded that bias tape the wrong direction. And now I'm going to just do a 1/4 inch stitch here at the end of it to finish off that end. And with this little teeny piece of fabric here, sometimes your machine, my machine definitely, gives me a little bit of trouble. Use your hand wheel, use your back stitch, do what you gotta do. The seam isn't visible, just make sure it's secure. Then you're going to take that little seam allowance that you just created and tuck it back inside the center of the bias tape. And I use my scissors or just sort of a dull pointy edge to kind of get that seam allowance tucked in there to a point. And now your end of your strap is nice and finished off, and we are going to top stitch it so that you won't be able to see any of that seam allowance at all. And I'm just going to stick a little binding clip on the end of it to leave it in place. And again, same as we did with the neckline binding, we are just going to top stitch along the edge of our bias tape here. And because the construction on each strap is mirrored, on one side we are going to be starting at the back neckline like I'm doing here and continuing along the armhole area all the way up through to the end of the strap. And then on the other side we'll be starting at the end of the strap, going down through the armhole and finishing at the back neckline. Amazing. I hope you're proud of yourself. This is definitely my favorite part of the pattern, seeing these straps come together. So good job. Now we need to create the channel for the back neckline. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish off that raw edge. I'm going to do it with my serger, and I will also say I shortened the length of my stitches on my serger as well. And again, if you don't have a serger, that is totally fine. You can finish it with a zigzag stitch or an overlocking stitch on your regular machine. And again, I'll reference you to the video that I have about how to do that. Once you finish that raw edge, we need to fold down the back neckline 5/8 of an inch. And it is really important to make sure that that is an even 5/8 of an inch all the way across, because we are going to be feeding our strap in through there. So I'm going to be using my hot ruler, which helps you evenly measure your hems. And it's a tool I've only recently discovered and I'm obsessed with it. It is so helpful. The material is made to be ironed on, so it's not going to melt. But I'm here just measuring 5/8 of an inch down from 3 key points in the center and then along both edges. Especially with a curved hem like that, I feel like that's the most helpful, is to kind of iron those key points, and then I'm kind of connecting my folded over edge to have one curved, even fold. Now you are going to edge stitch that folded channel in place and do lots of back stitching at the beginning and at the end. We definitely don't want this popping out of place. Now that your channel is done, it is time to tie our straps. So you could just completely eyeball it, and that is totally fine and wonderful. I have provided measurements in the pattern for your suggested like strap and channel lengths, just because I find that it's helpful to have some sort of reference point to start with. If you don't want to do that, again, that is completely fine. So here I'm just measuring my strap lengths and my channel lengths. I'm kind of like pinning everything in place as I'm going. Obviously I've made a lot of these at this point, so I kind of know how long I want my straps to be exactly. So that's why I'm doing it this way. And then once it's all tied, you can either try it on now, which you can totally do, or you can wait until the whole dress is done, because I find that the weight of the dress sometimes will change how you want your straps to lay. So either try it on now and adjust, or you can wait until your entire dress is done, try it on then, and adjust from there. And adjusting is really easy. At the end of the video, I kind of go through how I adjust my dress. I'll also note that I first tie my knot here in a double knot and then in a bow. I find that double knotting it first just helps everything stay in place. It doesn't slide around. It does make it a bit bulkier than maybe I would like, but I find that that is preferable than having the bow like fall apart while you're wearing the dress. So I do a double knot and then a bow, but again, you can tie yours however you want to. Alright, it's time to make a skirt. So first we just need to finish off the raw edges of all 4 of our pocket bags with your serger or your regular machine. And then if you're like me and you cut your skirts from the measurements and not from the pattern pieces, you may want to cut your notches now. So this is the top tier of the skirt. I'm first going to fold it in half and cut a notch at the center front, and then I'm going to fold it in half again and cut notches at like the 1/4 and 3/4 of the way mark. There's also a notch in the center along the top edge as well. Now I'm going to pin my pockets in place. So I am just pinning them 3 inches down along the edge here of the top tier of the skirt, and make sure that the pockets are laying face down, right sides together with the skirt as well. And then I'm going to use my serger to both finish off the raw edge here and also attach those pocket bags in place. Now we are going to flip that pocket out open, and we are going to understitch or kind of top stitch along the edge here. And this just helps the pocket bag not pop out when the dress is finished. Repeat those steps with all 4 of your pockets, 2 panels of your skirt, and then when they're done, we are going to lay the 2 panels on top of each other, right sides together, and pin around the edge here. We are then going to stitch along the side of the skirt, including the pocket bag. So start going down the skirt with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then when you get to the pocket bag, you're going to pick up your presser foot, pivot, and then continue along the curved edge of the pocket. And then once you get back around to the other edge of the side seam of the skirt, you are going to do the same thing. Pick your presser foot up, pivot. Again, I do some little back stitches here, and then continue down the side seam of the skirt. And if you're just doing one tier, or I guess no tiers, one really long skirt, this will look a little bit different, but the process is the same. Now we are going to press those seam allowances along the side seam of the skirt open, flat, and you can see you can't really press right where the pocket bag is, obviously, but you just get as close as you can, and it's not really a huge deal. Now we need to sew together the side seams of the bottom tier of the skirt if you're doing a bottom tier. So first lay those 2 panels on top of each other, right sides together, make sure they're going the same direction, and then pin along the side seams. Sew along the side seams at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then finish again those raw edges with your serger or your preferred method. So here I have my finished bottom tier all sewn up together. I've pressed that side seam flat with my iron, and I once again need to make my notches because I forgot to do that. So along this top edge of the bottom tier, I'm going to first fold it in half and cut a notch in the center, and then fold it in half again, which creates notches at the 1/3 and 3/4 of the way mark. So basically this just cuts the skirt into even segments. Along the top edge here of the bottom tier, we're going to do 2 rows of basting stitches, and this time we're going to do them first at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then the second row is going to be at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And this time, instead of stitching our final stitch in between the 2 basting stitches, we're going to do it as a 3rd row at 1/2 of an inch seam allowance, and that's just so that we don't have any visible basting stitches that we're going to have to unpick around this giant skirt. So there we have our 2 rows of basting stitches with our tails intact. So to connect our 2 tiers of our skirt, we are going to take the top tier, find the bottom edge where we've cut our notches. We're going to flip it upside down so that the bottom edge is now on the top where like the pocket bags are hanging out. We're going to find the side seam, and then pretty much what we're doing is putting that top tier inside of the bottom tier. So I'm finding the side seam on the bottom tier and lining it up with the side seam of the top tier, and I'm going to first pin those together. Now I'm going to continue my way around the edge of the skirts here and line up all of the different notches and the 2 side seams. So when you go all the way around, the top tier of the skirt will be inside of the bottom tier. In total, you should end up with 8 key spots where these skirts are pinned together. And the reason we do it this way is just because it helps the gathers be more even. If you kind of just want to skip over notches, you could just eyeball it. I just find it's helpful to kind of have these key points pinned together so that as you're gathering your skirt, everything stays kind of easy to handle. So now to gather your skirt, I'm going to start at the side seams where our tails of our basting stitches are hanging, and we're going to start going one direction all the way toward the other side seam, and then we'll pull the other direction going toward the side seam the other way. So here we are kind of going counterclockwise to the right, and then we'll go clockwise to the left. So pulling those 2 basting stitch threads there, we are going to grab a hold of them and pull the fabric to gather it. Once it's fairly even going around this side of the skirt, I'm then going to take it section by section and really fine-tune the gathers and pin them in place. So here's one side of the skirt fully gathered, pinned in place. And then like I said, we are going to now start going the other direction. So I'm taking those basting stitches at the side seam and pulling the opposite way, now going clockwise toward the opposite side seam. And there is the full skirt, totally pinned in place. I know it's a lot of pins, but you really can't overdo it in a situation like this. So now to stitch those gathers in place and attach these 2 skirts together, we are going to do a stitch at 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. So it will be below both of the basting stitches that we did. I take my time as I'm doing this stitch. You can see I kind of like adjust and readjust and use my fingers to kind of wiggle the gathers around as I'm stitching just to make sure everything's really nice and even. And here you can see that finished stitch. You'll see the 2 basting stitches and then the 3rd final stitch there. Now I'm going to finish off the raw edge of my seam allowance, and if you are not using a serger, because you can see here my serger's like cutting off probably about a 1/4 inch of my seam allowance. If you're not using a serger, I feel like it's a good idea to maybe trim off a 1/4 inch of the seam allowance, but that's totally up to you whether you want to do that or not. And that's what the finished product looks like. I find it really helpful to press my seam allowance up toward the top tier of the skirt here. It's really not necessary. I just like the look of it more. I feel like it helps the garment look a little bit less poofy and lets the gathers sit more nicely. So I'm going to press my gathers here a bit.
Now we're basically going to be repeating this whole gather process that we just did on the top tier of the skirt to attach it to the bodice. So along the top edge, we're stitching 2 rows of basting stitches, one at 1/4 inch and one at 3/8 of an inch. Here's a peek at those basting stitches all finished. And then we're basically just going to attach the bodice to the skirt. It doesn't matter which way the skirt is going at this point. It's the same front and back. So just pick either side. First attach the bodice and skirt at the side seams and then at the center front and center back notches. So again, those notches are helping us divide the skirt into more manageable chunks, but there's not as many of them for the top tier, which is really nice. And of course, if you opted not to do tiers in your skirt, you're just doing one long skirt, then this is the only bit of skirt gathering that you need to do. Once you've got your sections all pinned in place, we are going to find our basting stitches at the side seam, pull on those to gather our skirt, and follow exactly the same thing that we did with the bottom tier, kind of taking it section by section to evenly gather our skirt. Here are the gathers all pinned in place, and now we are going to secure them and attach the bodice to the skirt with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just a little note to keep an eye on the straps. Since they are so long, sometimes they can sneak their way in here, and I wouldn't want you to stitch over any of your straps. So be aware of those and then finish off your seam allowance. And then once again, I'm going to give my gathers a little bit of a press. The last thing we need to do is hem the dress. So I'm first going to fold my hem up 1/2 inch and then again up 1 inch. And I'm using my hot ruler again because it is amazing for hems. And I would recommend once you have pressed your hem in place, that's a great time to try your dress on, both to check the straps, make sure that they're good to go, see if you need to adjust them at all, and then also check the hem of your dress before you stitch that in place to see if you want to re-press your hem, if you want it to be higher or lower or whatever. But once your hem length is good to go, you can go ahead and edge stitch that in place and your dress will be finished.
Dress is all done. Let me give you a full look. Very, very happy with it. And I have to say, I really love this fabric. I was sort of on the fence about which one to use for this tutorial, but like this block print it's like very lightweight and like gathered really well, and it's not see-through at all. Yeah, I need to make more block print stuff. This was a good choice. Okay, so as far as adjusting it, right now it's tied like pretty snugly. I feel like this is how I would wear it if, you know, I'm not layering it. It's nice and secure up around here, you know, nothing's like gaping or anything like that. But if I wanted to layer it, or if I just wanted to wear it more like droopy, I would just retie the bow to be longer. So I could either take the dress completely off, retie it, do all the measuring stuff that we did. I don't really feel like that's necessary. I feel like the first time you tie it, it's nice to kind of have those measurements as a frame of reference. But once it's been tied and you've tried it on and you want to make adjustments, which the very first time if you put it on and it's like super tight, like super up high or super droopy, don't stress, like it's extremely adjustable and everyone's bodies are just different. So the adjustment is super, super easy. I'm not gonna take the entire dress off. I'm just gonna slip it off my shoulders, spin the bow around to the front, kind of adjust it from there. And I don't want it super, super looser. I might just take it out like 1 inch. So I'll show you how I do that, and don't worry, I'm wearing a bra. But I'm just going to swing it around this way. You can see the bow's there. So it's in a double knot and then a bow. I'm gonna pinch the straps just so that it doesn't completely lose where I had tied it before. Loosen this knot up a little bit, and then I'm just sliding the knot up like 1 inch. So the old knot was like right here. I just slid it up that much, and honestly, a little bit goes a long way. And it's done. And I'm also gonna mention, I got a lot of questions about what bra to wear with this dress. And first and foremost, you can wear whatever you want to wear. There's no like right or wrong bra to wear. I personally wear this like bandeau, it's almost like a tank top, honestly. It's from Free People. I'll link it in the description. But I have several of these and they're really nice to wear just like under strappy dresses. And I actually talked kind of in depth about this on my Instagram stories, and I saved it all to a highlight. So if you want like other people's opinions or ideas of what bras to wear, you can go check that out. Also, a lot of people were just like, I just wear my bra and it shows and I don't care. And that's amazing. There's no reason we need to hide our bra straps. Okay, so here's the dress retied. And again, I feel like it doesn't look like crazy droopy. I only took it down an inch, but I can feel it. Like, it feels looser. And if I wanted to put a t-shirt under it, I would probably take it out another like 2 or 3 inches and it would be like really loose and baggy. I just don't want it to be like hanging super low when it's just a standalone dress. So that is how you adjust the dress, easy peasy. And then finally, if you are wanting to do any of the hacks for this dress, if you're wanting to make a top, if you're wanting to do the tie in the center, if you're wanting to do a patchwork one, if you want to do a built-in bra, there's so many ways that you can adjust this pattern to be like a whole new thing. So don't forget to check out the last like 2 or 3 pages of the pattern. I just kind of started rambling and I was like, oh, you could do this and this and this. And I just gave you like a bunch of ideas. So you check out the last few pages. I've given guidance on how to do a bunch of different changes. And then there's a few accompanying tutorials as well if you want to actually follow another video. So tag me in your Skyline dresses. I am obsessed with this pattern. I feel like it looks great on a variety of body types. I personally will be wearing it for the foreseeable future. I've made 9 of them so far, not really on purpose, just because I'm so excited about all the different versions. So tag me if you make them, and I'm proud of you.